Hello, good evening. It is Wednesday evening, the 4th of October. I want to start off with a little sound. That, those five musical alien notes are from one of my favorite movies of all time, Close Encounters. When they were writing that movie, putting it together, Steven Spielberg wanted to go against type, and he wanted to show an alien space movie that was not about these evil aliens coming from another world, uh, spent on, bent on destroying us all, which was like War of the Worlds, Dave the Triffids, a lot of different films in the past. It was always looking at aliens as this threat to humans. Um, and that really came to a head with the Twilight Zone episode. There was a sketch on Twilight Zone that Rod Serling had wrote called "The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street," which deals with this whole idea of the unknown threat and paranoia that happens when communication is lost. Topic, as you notice from the title, is on the idea of communication. What is it? How do you communicate? I'm going to look at different aspects of communication, different communication types, why we communicate the way we do, history. Uh, Please feel free to subscribe on my video. It's down in the lower corner. You'll see a little icon. Click on subscribe. And as I've said in the past, all my nightly talks feed into the topics that I talked on previously. So start with the first one, and I'm building towards different aspects that all kind of are interconnected. They're different angles, but they all have sort of a connective tissue. So that is kind of so tonight's issue is on the issue of communication. Um, so the first question you have to ask is, what is communication? In its most generic term, communication is basically the sharing of information from one party to another. It's in its most basic form. It's the idea of taking an idea, a thought, a bit of information, and giving it to another party. It's an exchange that can be seen in a couple of different ways. It can be seen as unidirectional in one way. I'm just sending the message out there. Or it can be, you send it out there not expecting a reply. You're just sending it out there. Okay. The other way is you're sending it out and you're wanting it to be reciprocated. So you're giving something in the hopes of getting something back. The third way of communicating is just two or more parties delivering information as an end in and of itself, keeping people informed of something, not expecting a response, not expecting sort of a reciprocated um, exchange. You're just keeping everybody in the loop. Those are the three types. Now, communication can take different forms of that, but that's kind of where um, the three different types of communication that are there. Now, there's also different types or different ways of communicating. And that's done through the senses. That would be, right now we have five senses that we use for communication: sight, touch, taste, sound, and smell are five senses. Sensory organs that allow us to take in information and deliver information to the outside world. Now, some people say that there's a sixth sense, and that would be intuition, a way of feeling, becoming aware of information being received from some non tangible source. So that could be a sixth sense of receiving information through a non tangible source for awareness. Uh, and so, kind of looking at some different movies. So, Close Encounters, the way that the aliens communicated and the humans communicated were through basically mathematics and sound. When Steven Spielberg was writing the script, he wanted to have the idea of communication take place in a universal context. Throughout the universe, in every, and even on our Earth, there are some common areas of communication that we all share. Mathematics, uh, the idea of, 1 + 1 = 1, grouping. That's universal in terms of the types of math involved. And sounds, musical notes. There's only 7 musical notes in all of music, and there's variations of those 7. Every song you've ever heard is just variations on 7 notes. Those variations are the pitch and tone of those notes, and then the organization and how they're expressed is the math, your beats. So, a 4 beat, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4. Your time signature. I have a theater background and a music background, doing choir, and I play guitar, and so understanding your beats is a mathematical approach to delivering sound and delivering you know a communication, information. So Close Encounters dealt with sound as the form of communication used, and that was what that was from, was how the aliens communicated back and forth with us was through sounds. And then Kodale had, I forgot the first name, but it was hand sounds. The hand sounds in Close Encounters was da 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 da. So it's up, down, da, 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 da. So that was the Kodale hand sounds that were um, aligned with the musical notes. Now, the another movie I wanted to bring up, it's not really on the first that you'd think of in terms of communication, but it is. And again, I put all the links to anything I reference is in the description, so you will see little clips of different things that I've referenced tonight, and you can go through and click on each of those links of what I've talked about. In the movie The Sixth Sense, it's a scary film about a kid who can see dead people. And it stars Bruce Willis, Haley Joel Osment. It's a great thriller. I won't spoil it for you. It's got a pretty good twist ending. But this kid has the ability to see people who've died and died wrongly. Their deaths were questionable. So he's able to kind of be an interpreter for the dead to the living to help resolve some of their deaths. And there's this key scene in the film, and no one believes him. Everyone thinks he's got mental problems, but he can actually see dead people. And there's this whole great line, I see dead people. There's this scene where his mom is really struggling, and he's in a car with her, and she's going through her own issues and struggling with him and his problems. That she thinks she has problems, and he is frustrated because he doesn't think people believe him. And at one point, he talks to his mom about grandma, her mom, and there were some issues there. And he basically starts to tell her that her grandma apologizes for a misunderstanding that took place when the mom was a kid. Now, the mother had never told the child this, and the kid proceeds to tell her exactly where and what had happened and what had occurred from a different angle. And the mother starts breaking down because she realizes, oh my God, no one would know that story. I haven't told that story to anybody. And so in that movie, you had intuition being the mode for receiving information and giving it out there using verbal. Now, another movie I love is When Harry Met Sally. And When Harry Met Sally is a great romantic comedy. It's a classic. Anybody who's ever been in a relationship and the differences between men and women and the personality types of how we communicate and what we do, um, that movie hits on so many different levels. And it's so true about the differences between men and women and how we view things, how we process information. It's one of my favorite romantic comedies. You get a chance, and so I posted the ending scene from that movie where they both come to an agreement about saying what needs to be said, understanding and the misunderstandings. And then one of the last films I kind of want to bring up is a 1970s film about Vietnam, black and white film starring, was it Jason Robards and I want to say Sam Robards? Could be wrong there. But it's called Johnny Got His Gun. And it takes place, it's in the 70s, but it's in reference to the Vietnam War, but I believe it's also about World War II, about a guy who goes into battle, soldier, and he has all of his limbs blown off, arms, legs blown off. And his face is pretty much blown off. He has no way to communicate with the outside world. He's gotten and so he's laying in bed limbless, and he's got a mask over his face, and all he can do is hear and move his body. And it's the whole movie is the doctors are dealing with this character, not knowing how to treat him. Is he alive? Is he dead? I mean, he's alive, but they don't really know of a way to, they know his brain is working, they think, but they don't really have a way of communicating with him. And so he figures out a way to communicate with them is by nodding his head, doing SOS, using Morse code. And so the movie gets into this whole issue about euthanasia, assisted suicide, what is life, and it has a whole other subtext. But the core of it is this man found a way to communicate with the outside world when all of his other senses, for the most part, were robbed of him than ones that he'd normally go to, speech and writing as a means of communicating. And now I'm going to touch base on words. One of my favorite bands growing up, I love music. I have such a wide range of musical influences, musical interests. One of my favorite bands when I was a kid, and to this day I love his solo work, is Men at Work. Colin Hay, who was the lead singer, lives not too far from me, and I've seen him live several times, and I actually became friends with him for a season. And he actually helped me propose to my ex-wife, and it was kind of cool. We got to hang out with him at the concert, him and his wife, and it was a really magical time. And we've kind of remained in contact here and there. But I love his music. And in the '80s, on the first album, it was called Business as Usual. He had a song called People Just Love to Play with Words. And the song kind of deals with the manipulation of words to get what you want. And so I love it. So that's included in there. Now, I want to look at some different notable people in history, celebrities and whatnot, who've used different means of communication that were not the norm. First ones that come to mind: Helen Keller. Helen Keller was deaf, blind, and mute. So she did not have the ability. Little people thought she was. The term was, and it's a politically incorrect term. It's called deaf, dumb, and blind. Mute, basically. She couldn't communicate. But the movie was it The Miracle Worker, which was done on her life. Patty Duke, and I forgot. I want to say I forgot who the other actress was. Married to Mel Brooks. Anyway, the movie was based on her life about how she learned to communicate and how she became a educator later on in her life with the gifts that she had. With she had limited means to communicate, but she had learned to communicate. Who else? Ray Charles. Ray Charles had his eyesight taken from him at a young age. Now he couldn't communicate and couldn't do things visually, but he learned to communicate through music, and he developed this musical ability. Same with Stevie Wonder. Ray Charles was amazing. Who else was there? Stephen Hawking's. Here's a man, a brilliant mind, who developed ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and I talked about him on the other one of the other podcasts I did. Brilliant mind, scientist, who found a way. He was locked into his wheelchair, and he was basically had no means of physicality, but he was able to work with other engineers and whatnot. And they created a computer system that allowed him to visually look at a keyboard with words and whatnot, and it would track his eyes, and he could communicate by choosing the words, and he could have discussions with people, and he could talk about lessons. So up until his passing, he was still communicating with the outside world these amazing thoughts about science, about the cosmos. I have one of his DVDs up there that they did on the complete history of time that I do watch on occasion. And one other one. This is a weird one. It's not a human. Coco the gorilla. It was a gorilla that passed away a few years ago that they had in, I think, in the Bay Area, that they had trained with 600 words, human words that the gorilla could memorize, and sign language, and communicate with with the trainers. And Coco the gorilla could actually have conversations, limited 600 word vocabulary, but enough to talk about wants and desires, and have limited exchanges back and forth. So those are different people and different organisms, creatures using different types of communication for different purposes. So in terms of communication, we have to look at some issues. We know why we communicate. We want to share something. We want to get information out there, and that's why people communicate with us. It's information sharing back and forth. It's like the internet. What I'm doing here, it's a form of communication, sharing out in the world. Hopefully, I get feedback. There are stages to the complexity of communication. From about birth through adolescence, communication is usually because of the lack of cognitive ability in your brain. It starts to develop a little more as you get older. Most communication that takes place from birth through adolescence is, for the most part, unidirectional. It's the idea of the person expressing the communication, expressing the thought, is expressing a want, a need, a desire. Whether it's as a baby, will cry because that's the only form of communication they know, or kick, or scream, whatever, or coo, to get something, to have some need met. Nourishment, um, affirmation, a hug, uh, you know, some sort of need that is lacking. The only communication really taking place by that infant up and through, in the adolescent years, it's, I'm communicating because I want something. It's about getting fed, getting focused on, getting needs met. And there is for lack of a better term, there's kind of a narcissistic attitude of the world is about me because that's the only frame of reference. I can't take care of myself physically, emotionally, whatever. So I'm going to communicate out there because other people have to take care of me. And as you get older, as you start to exist in the world, you start to develop social connection. And if you're socially connecting properly, what you start to see is as you express yourself, you come in contact with other people who are doing the same that you are. And you start to realize, oh, I'm not the only one here. And I'm usually the one expressing my needs to other people to take care of me. But somebody's coming along now expressing to me a need they have that they want me to take care of. So as you get older, hopefully in a healthy environment, in a healthy way, we start to understand that as we get older, we develop a sense of empathy. Now, there's a difference between empathy and sympathy, and I don't think a lot of people realize what that is anymore. Or the language is very important to me, and a lot of language is getting lost. It's getting muddied. Empathy is the idea of feeling somebody's pain, seeing their need, and wanting to take care of it with the potential that it causes you some sacrifice. Somebody is in need of something that I can provide and take care of them. But there's a risk that if I do that, I might lose something in exchange. And empathy is being okay with that process, having empathy for somebody going through what they're going through and deciding that their burden can, you'll, you don't need to, but you can take along their burden and help shoulder it with them. Sympathy is having the ability to see somebody in pain, acknowledge it, help them, but only so much as it doesn't inconvenience you and cause you to sacrifice. So I have sympathy for people. Here's 20 bucks. Go about my business. I I I see what you're going through. Here's 20 bucks, boom. And that's my sympathy. You have my sympathies. And a lot of times we hear in society when somebody goes through a hard time or we see a tragedy, our thoughts and prayers are with you. Anybody can give you thoughts and prayers. Really doesn't cause any investment on your part. And how many people actually have those thoughts and have those prayers when they say it? How many times have you heard somebody say, I'll pray for you as you're going through your hardship, and then walk along the way and never even give a second thought to the person? I'm guilty of that. That's sympathy, but no empathy. Um, and as you get older, hopefully, you will develop empathy for people, shouldering their burden along with them, not so that you get something from the exchange, but so that whatever they get, they need, and you're okay with that temporary loss of whatever you lose in the process. Now, there are some people out there who, and that's kind of a delicate balance because some people, because they don't have regulated emotions and certain emotional maturity, sometimes they go all in and it becomes very dysfunctional and it can be a codependent relationship situation, codependency, and that's a whole other issue. I'm not going into that here, but I'm just talking about in generalized the nature, the issue between empathy and sympathy. So once you start to move out of adolescence and you start to go into the world, if you're being raised properly, you start to develop empathy where your need for communication is not so much about being heard and being accepted and made sure that you're validated, moves from that mode from birth to adolescence. You move into other affirmation, seeking to affirm other people, seeking to validate others. And when you move into that issue of communication, when you validate others and you seek to listen, you seek to understand before you're being understood, what happens is the person on the receiving end feels validated. They feel that you're showing empathy, they feel that you're showing true concern, and it makes them want to open up to you even more. And this wonderful dance of communication. Otherwise, what you have is conquest going back and forth. I had somebody that I was connected to for a while. Early on, I found out that every conversation was a conquest. It was some sort of competition, competition to be heard, a competition to, it's like people, what was it with the broom where you put your hands on the broom and you try to get to the top, to the top, to the top? Every conversation with this person ended up being some sort of negotiation where one of the other parties was trying to win the tennis match to come out on top, however they thought it was. And it was tiring. I mean, I've dealt with several people like that. And I had to look at my life and go, oh my gosh, that person, that person, that person. I've seen it a lot in my life. And I had to, like, okay, distance. I had to put distance there because that's not a healthy type of communication. It's not really reciprocal and in a healthy fashion. It's more unidirectional in conquest. Uh, the desire is to be heard and understood instead of really listening to understand. And so I've learned a lot through that time. So what are the boundaries to this communication? Language, from culture to culture. The young kids today speak a different language than us old farts. In the 80s, we had words like killer, dude. We had all this slang. It's radical, far out, man, whatever. Now, kids use a whole different slang. And when we were the cool young ones, now I'm the old one and I hear the young kids using their own slang and some of it carries over. And then there's just language in general, different cultures, English, you know, French, German, all these different languages, language barriers in general. Then you have the issues of cultural norms that separate, using hand signals. In America, V for victory. But here, if you use that, I think in Japan or in the Asian cultures, this is a sign of F you. Now you turn it around, bugger all, piss off in England, you know? Then, of course, the middle finger, you know? Some people, no, that means number one. Not in some cultures. In some cultures, it's a pretty definite statement and a negative. So you have cultural norms. Then you have expectations. Some people go into conversations with an expectation on the outset of how they want the other person to respond. Have you ever dealt with somebody who only wants you to tell them what they want to hear? They've got it set in their mind that this is what they're going to do. They ask you for advice, and then you give them something they don't want to hear, and then they fight you on it. And then you have to say, well, what do you want me to say? Tell me what you want. When you realize that they really didn't care what you had to say at all, they had firmly set in your mind, they just wanted validation on the direction they were going. You realized that they weren't really interested in hearing what you had to say at all. It was just basically an exchange to affirm for them what they already wanted to do. A lot of times I call those ASKHOLES, ask holes. Those are people who really don't want your opinion. They just want to feel right. So they'll ask you and basically want you to be a parrot to affirm what they already believe. You can't really help those people. They're going to do what they're going to do. And it's a cycle. So then you have cognitive and emotional development. So cognitive development is some people have a deficiency. I used to teach behavioral. I taught behavioral special ed for a time, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade. Um, from the autism spectrum to uh, anger issues, and some with minor, for lack of develop, they were slow developmentally. Um, and it's interesting. I'll talk about autism. I have a lot of background with autism. I have former family members who've had autism. I've been around it a lot, and there are different types of autism. They call it on the spectrum. And the one type that I've had a lot of background in is autism that really develops the analytical side of the brain and the literal side of the brain. Everything's very linear and order and control and very exact. There's not a lot of conceptualization happening in the brain. It's all very linear in how it processes information. Literalism. I have dealt with these people trying to talk about emotional things, and it's just not there. They don't have that part of their brain that clues into emotional empathetic awareness of the other person. I had a conversation with somebody one time. Every conversation I had with this person, I was always wrong. Always wrong. But their answer would always come back. Not I was wrong because of emotions or whatever. It was because I was wrong analytically with some fact, some piece of knowledge. Finally, I had to pull this person aside and said, you know what? I don't care that you've had these amazing career experiences. I don't care that you worked on this amazing project, Saturn V, and all this other stuff, and they were part of the space program, and they've done all these amazing things. You know what I care about? How you doing, man? You want to go out and get a beer? Just hang? Go tell some jokes? And they just looked at me like a deer in headlights. They couldn't fathom. They just did not know. It's kind of like Spock from Star Trek. Does not compute. So they don't have that emotional connectedness. Now, there's another side of this, emotional development. I talked earlier about the idea of birth through adolescence. In the first 5 to 7 years of your life is when all of your major personality cognitive issues become cemented. Because from birth to about 5 to 7, everything you experience, for the most part, is a brand new experience in your world with nothing as a frame of reference. And as you start to age out of that range, then you start to experience things again. And if your first experiences are negative as a first experience, and you believe that this is kind of the norm because you don't have anything else to compare it to, and the discomfort that comes with this, the moment you experience that again, it reaffirms that this is the norm. So it starts to build in a dysfunctional view of social adjustment in the world. A so you, and then as you start to get good experiences, the problem is you've got 5 to 7 years of bad experiences. So for every new experience, it's going to have to take years of positive experiences to wipe out that hardwiring. And if you're still in the next few years of your life from 7 through 12 and on, especially when you start going through puberty and you go through your teen years, if you start getting positive experiences, but you have all those negative experiences in your environment still building on, the negative is influencing your psyche, your emotional maturity, your emotional development far more than the positive. Unless you do a clean break and you have to cut it off. Now, not a lot of people can. So what you end up with is you end up with adults who technically, if you look at their pattern, you look at their emotional development, they haven't really evolved and matured because they're still technically in adolescence, emotional adolescence. And how do you know that? How can you see that? A lot of times kids need discipline because left to their own devices, children are a kid without boundaries will run everywhere and do anything. Freedom, creative. They'll just because they have this boundless energy in them. And that's awesome. And we want to encourage that. We want kids to be creative, but left to its own devices, if you don't have discipline and you don't have this ability to help that child hone that cognitive ability, all that energy, what you get is you get a dynamo of lack of focus. So what you get is, you hear it all now ADHD and all these other classifications. Well, and that's another thing that the whole medical community jumps on. Uh, that's another issue I'll go on to in terms of overdiagnosing and overprescribing drugs and feeding the whole pharmaceutical. That's a whole other issue. But what you end up with is you end up with these adults that are so out of kilter because they never had the proper discipline of how to be functional adults to take whatever they were learning and say, okay, you know what, that's good, but let's fashion this in a proper context. Let's push it because once those negative traits have been cemented in 5 to 7 years old, then you go into puberty when the physiological hormones are now kicking in, changing your body even more and your psyche even more. There's an old saying about I've become my own worst enemy. It's bad enough that you had the outside influences uh, formulating your life. Now you've got your own body working against you because the chemicals that cause us to think screwy. I've got a teen. I remember when I was a teenager, I hated my dad. I hated a lot of things. I was trying to find my name, my way in the world. I was this way, and that way. I couldn't stand certain things about my parents. I couldn't this. Well, now that I'm older and I've lived through some things and I've had a chance to settle certain things and work through some of my issues, and I've always sought to be self-reflective and brutally self-honest, take ownership. My dad had some problems. He did. My parents had their own set of problems, but I learned a lot from my dad. My dad was right on a lot of things. He really was. Now, I had to sift through the negatives and find those kernels of positive. But when my dad was right, he was solid. And I learned, like I was talking to the other one, take the best and leave the rest in terms of communication. So those are some of the things that affect how we communicate with people and why we communicate, what we do, and if it affects. Now, for the longest time growing up, I'm an acquired taste. I have a very strong personality. And people who know me and have been with me, uh, first impressions can overwhelm people, turn people off. But the more time people spend with me, certain personalities I'll always turn off. It's just because that's their personality. But other people who hang in with me, who've known me for a long time, say, "Oh yeah, I get it. Got to get over that personality curve," and that is my hardwiring. But once they see past that, and they're like, "Oh yeah, he's pretty solid. He'll piss me off. He'll say things, and it'll rub me the wrong way, but I know his heart. So if he's telling me something I don't want to hear, he's not doing it just to be a jerk. I might think he is. It might feel like he is, but when I get past that and see, oh yeah, you know what? He does care. And I have some really good friends in my life that I've had for 20, 30 years that see that. Now I've had friends just as long that over the last couple of years I've had to actually cut ties because I had to look at the nature of how we communicated, the nature of our friendship and the nature of our relationship, and realize we never had that strong connection as much as I wanted it. Why? Because we were in the true fact of it was we were different in how we communicated, and that bridge was never going to get that divide was never going to be mended because on their end or my end it's just too different, two different paths, and that's okay. So as I said, so some people never emotionally develop past the early stages of communication because of cognitive uh, underdevelopment due to internal deficiencies, like they've got a medical issue, psychological issue, or external environmental issues that you ever heard the term some people aren't crazy, but their environment made them crazy? It's like people who go into war who came in who are great people. Like that happened a lot with Vietnam. People would go in, these young guys would go in all gusto, come out and they have what they call the 100-yard stare. Their psychology of what they experienced, the post-traumatic stress, completely altered their psychology, and they had to spend years of true therapy to undo what had happened. Some of them didn't make it, or some of them, you know, took their own lives, self combusted, or some of them just lived in this unfulfilled, bipolar up and down state that comes in waves, and then they just never really conquered that because of the price to them was too high. So that's the idea of that affecting communication. Now, I want to talk about another issue here on the issue of offense. I heard a comedian one time, was his name Jimmy Carr, British comedian I love. Very Very politically incorrect. So funny. Very he tells some of the most obtuse, offensive jokes. And he was asked one time, can somebody asked him, what's the most offensive joke you ever told? And he says, I can't tell you. He goes, well, why? He goes, because offense is taken, not given. I can say something completely innocuous. My intention is just, I could say, I love milk. Somebody, because of their bias, their view on the world, will come along and hear this. You love milk. Well, why do you love milk? Why don't you love orange juice? And then they start, I'm offended that you don't like orange juice and you didn't mention orange juice. That how dare you leave out orange juice and only like milk? What is wrong with you? And then they go on to this tirade. People who look to be offended, they're going to find it because of their internal spirit, the need to be validated by any means necessary, be catered to. That is, and that goes back into the adolescent stage of why we communicate, to be placated to. Children oftentimes act out negatively. Why? Because they know negative attention is still attention and they got your focus. So they'll get angry, they'll growl, they'll do all those things when you push them because now the focus is on them and they got what they wanted. They got somebody focusing on them for that moment and it put them in the driver's seat and them in control. So this one guy that I deal with, he goes, you let a lot of things roll off your back anymore. He said, I used in the past, I didn't. I got mad at everything and I'd fight everything. And he goes, you're a California boy, you let it roll off your back. And I go, because I don't have to fight everything. It's not worth my time. Not everything is not every battle I see is one that I need to jump in on. Now I will stand up for things when I need to. But at the end of the day, I'm trying to live a different life of communication, trying to develop a different aspect of my life. I will fight. But certain things I'll just let roll off my back. I'll fight certain things. I will be a bulldog when I think it's right to be a bulldog. And there's something that I learned. I don't know where I came up with this, but it was about the truth. You always hear the thing of your truth, my truth, the universal truth, the objective truth, whatever. Came up with a concept. The truth in communication is always offensive, no matter how it's packaged, to those unwilling or unable to hear it. Let me say that again. The truth is always offensive, no matter how it's packaged, to those unwilling or unable to hear it. I'll give you a couple examples. I'm kind of a loud guy. Now, but I'm as and the differences between men and women and how we communicate. Um, I am very passionate when I talk. Now, some people hear my words and my passion and they say I'm yelling, and I'm not. I go, you haven't heard me yell. But in their ears, I'm yelling. Their interpretation is I'm yelling. So I got to tone it down. I have to get to a whisper sometimes. And they're like, you're still yelling. I had somebody else tell me sometime, and we would argue back and forth. And they're like, you're not hearing me. You're not hearing me. And I would repeat exactly back to them 100% verbatim what they said. Well, you're not hearing me. And then it hit me. Oh, they equate hearing what they're saying with agreeing with what they're saying and doing what they say. Oh, so this exchange is about dominance. If I let go, say everything that they say is true, and do exactly what I said, then they felt heard. So this isn't healthy because it always leaves one person out of the equation. So and every time I would say I disagree, that would bring this other person into an irate nature, because they were not used to being disagreed with. And when you disagreed with them, they felt it as a challenge to their sense of validity. So, my understanding in dealing with, and I've dealt with a few people like this in my life, have looking back and saying, okay, yeah, that was all right, I see it. That person hadn't moved out of the adolescent phase of communication. They were still kind of in that back, that they hadn't developed empathy yet. It was still of the communication is only about pacification of their needs. So those are some of the issues. So in terms of all that, and building on the previous lessons that we've gotten to where we're at, if we grow in love, unity, purpose, and we let go of control, we leave a legacy centered on communication. We become great communicators because we learn to do something. We learn that communication is about not being understood, but understanding first. Seeking to understand the other person, to validate them first. Missionaries. What separated good missionaries from bad missionaries? The ones that got killed a lot of times, or as opposed to the ones that got accepted. If I was to go, being an American, to the deepest jungles and say I wanted to share something, people know, I actually got railed on this issue because somebody brought their baggage to the conversation. That's another theory. But the idea being is, if I wanted to go to another country and share something that I learned here in the other country, if I go in there as I'm an American, this is what you're doing, this is what you're doing wrong, and you need to learn English. If I'm going to, like, Russia, you need to learn English, and then I will teach you this new lesson in English to you Russians so that you can be like us and you can all be happy. Pretty arrogant, right? Pretty self-centered. More than likely going to be ostracized and kicked out because the people on the receiving end are like, who the hell are you to come into our neighborhood, act like you own the place, like we're nothing, and then try to change us? There's a guy I watch on YouTube who all he does, his whole YouTube thing is he learns languages. His whole thing is, and he goes and he films himself like he's just this Jewish kid from New York, but he learns Mandarin. He learns all these different languages, and he'll go to different parts of New York into the restaurants, and he'll secretly film himself ordering food. He'll start talking in English, and then he'll break into Cantonese, Mandarin, and you just see the people who are of those ethnic origins start shocked that this kid is learning this. And then the moment he does, they start embracing him. He did one where he went to this tribe, one of the deepest tribes in Africa. He talked with somebody else about learning their native tongue, and they flew him out there, filmed it, and he was immediately accepted into this tribe. And they said, "You are one of us. You are." And they brought him around. That he ate their foods with them. He had gained their trust. He had gained their respect. And in learning their world, learning about them, and seeing that this white Jewish kid, was willing to do that, then they were, when he would bring a gift in, they're like, "What is this? This is cool." And he would share things, and likewise, and back and forth. And it opened his whole sense of community, which I talked about earlier, about the idea of community, of what we're all about. So going through and learning about other people first, and really genuinely wanting to know. You ever deal with some people that they're not really listening to you, they're just waiting for you to end talking so they can tell you about what they want to talk about? I've been guilty of that. I think we all have in one form or another. But there are some people out there that it's a hardwired narcissism. It's a hardwired thing in there, and they don't even. They've been doing it so long they don't even realize they're doing it anymore. But it is. It's just. It's a part of them at this point. It would take some real re-education, I guess is the term. Some deep, hard work to get that done. I want to talk to you really quick. I said about the idea of becoming a great communicator. Now, I don't want to go into too much politics because he had, you know, history is uh, you can go a couple of different ways, but I will cover a couple of positives and negatives. Our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, his nickname was the Great Communicator. Now, I know for some people herald, and I have you ever been to the Reagan Library? I think it's great. There's a lot of history there. Some people abhor, they hate Reagan. Some people love him. Others, like myself, see him for who he was. He was good and bad, and he had complexities. But he was a great communicator. He started off as an actor. He knew how to enunciate. He knew how to learn lines. He knew how to read a room. He could walk in and he could talk to you as if you were a part of that, and he, like, you were reaching out to him. And there were some positives of his communication. One of the positives, in terms of him being able to communicate a message, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that opened up the door between the East and the West. And that started the decline of the Cold War and the decline of Russia. Now, there's a big fight, obviously, of the old guard trying to rebuild the USSR and trying to, keep that Cold War alive. That's a whole other discussion. So he had a good foreign policy in that regard, and he was liked by several of the allies that we had during that time. Now, there were some negatives to his communication, and two areas I want to bring up. The anti-drug campaign of the 80s, Just Say No. Now, it was meant well, good in heart, but it's not practical. How do you tell somebody who's living in a downtrodden, poor neighborhood, no business prospects, no ability really to get out of there, and the only way to make money, the only way to earn a living within those downtrodden environments at the time, were to sell drugs and do drugs and you get caught up into it? That was a communication breakdown. Somebody who was not really understanding the audience and empathizing with their plight, and just throwing it out, an attitude of take 2 pills and call me in the morning. And the other one, the AIDS crisis. because of how it came on fast in the community that it hit the hardest during those early years, the homosexual community. They called it the gay disease. And because it spread the widest through that community at the time, and we thought that it was relegated to just that community. But then we started to see it affecting others. Arthur Ashe, who got it through a blood transfusion. Ryan, I think his name was Ryan White, had it. We started seeing actors pop up. Now, some of them were gay, some of them were not. Uh, you had the first really big one, and he was always considered the man's man. Was Rock Hudson. I think that was 84, 85 when he came out. And now his was more than likely due to promiscuous activity. But what we found was over the time that it was, if you were in, it didn't matter whether you were gay or straight, but if you were, and even our blood testing, some people got it through transfusions. Arthur Ashe, mafia leader Greg Scarpa, uh, developed it when he got, had surgery and got it through that. I think Ryan White was another kid who got it through blood transfusion. He was a young kid who had gotten it. When we started to see down the road, more data came out that there were a lot of ways to get it, um, but the stigma was done. The lack of attention to really addressing it, because it wasn't really addressed during Reagan's era very well. So that was a breakdown on communication on their part of how to show empathy and really be compassionate when we could have been and we weren't as a society. So I want to kind of close here on a couple of things to bring it all back to center. And what that is this. If you want to be a good communicator, you want to have fulfilling relationships with people. You want to have a connection with people. You have to really be willing to set yourself aside. Ask yourself, why am I engaging with people? Is it to be validated, to take from the exchange? Or is it to give to the exchange? And how do I give? How do I validate others? By letting them have the floor, and I don't need to dominate the floor. Letting them communicate with me the way they communicate. It might be weird for me at first because it's not how I want to hear it. But if I seek to understand them from their point of view and I let go of that control and don't fight it, then maybe I allow that person to be comfortable in my presence. I had a person that I knew years ago. Again, I'm a passionate person. And this actually is between men and women too, and I've seen it in that aspect. You're too loud. You're too loud. And I'm like, you're yelling. And I'm like, I'm not yelling. I'm actually talking very silently. Well, you're still yelling. And then I realized something. It wasn't the tone that was getting them mad. It was the message that they didn't want to hear. And if they could mask it by saying that my tone was too loud, what they're basically saying is, shut up. I don't want to hear your message. But they were using a different way of addressing it. Because the only way I could get any louder or any quieter was to whisper or be quiet. That's what they ultimately wanted. They wanted me to be quiet because they didn't want to hear the message. But they kept saying, you're loud. Now you're being sarcastic. So anything I was saying was going to be offensive to them because they didn't really want to hear it. And so in that instance, there was no communication that was going to happen because they had shut down. And I've had some people in my life that's their go-to. I can't have a conversation with them anymore because that's where they operate. So, all that being said, if you really want to communicate in this world, you really want to have connections with people, deep connections, go out into the world, listen with no intent other than just to listen. Quiet yourself, let go, invest in others. Don't fight to take reins of the conversation. Don't fight to find your voice. Let them have the floor. Let other people shine. When you do that and other people shine, it was it Calvin Coolidge said, was it Calvin Coolidge or Harry Truman? It's amazing what you can get accomplished when you don't care who gets the credit. When you give other people the ball and let them run with it, and you just communicate and let them communicate, and you hear them, it's amazing what you get in return. But some people can't do that because they're afraid of getting left out, not acknowledged. And it's that fear that drives all their communication. So anyway, so thank you for tonight. Uh, that was kind of where we're at. I'm a little over my time now, but please subscribe to my channel if you like these. I'm going to keep trying to do these, 5 nights a week, maybe a little more if I can. And I'll be doing other types of content later on. But yeah, so anything, and again, anything I referenced tonight is in the description, all the clips. So go and watch the clips. Go into the world, have a great night, seek to understand before being understood, and watch how your world changes. Have a good night, and please subscribe.